All right. Hey, everybody. It is October 11th. Hard to believe, but it's already getting cold out here in North Carolina, which is lovely. We are here for Office Hours Live, and today I am joined by soon to be Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple. Lauren, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me twice.
I don't think you have to thank me. You know, we're all co-equal partners in mass, but I'll take it. I'll accept that.
Well, I've
Um,
seen chatters on the Facebook about these auditions for co-hosts, so
yeah.
I wasn't sure, the how much I had to really suck up in order to get the position.
Yeah, so I'm a master of psychology. So like when Mike is on, I really lean into the audition component. I wanted to make you feel very comfortable. So I'm like, no, it's just an informal chat, nothing to worry about. But it is an audition. So after we go through a few rounds, I'll kind of decide who wins, who gets to do this every Wednesday night instead of having dinner with their family. Quite the prize.
It is.
Um, how are things up in Canada? Is it snowing yet?
It is snowing in Montreal, but I'm in Ontario, so no snow here as of yet, but it's definitely colder.
Coming. I mean, I don't want to talk about the weather all night, but I'm loving this cold weather. I'm so happy about it. But I tell you what, let's dive in and let's answer some questions from listeners. The first one that I want to answer, I'm trying to find it in my outline here, but yes, this was one that I just had to answer because I think it's very practical, very useful. I think everyone listening is going to put this into action and implement this very soon. Danny asked, what's the state of the literature regarding the effects of microgravity on muscle protein synthesis? So, dozens of listeners, maybe a large percentage, are planning to maybe go to the International Space Station and live there for a while. In microgravity, what can you expect in terms of your gains? Um, Now, Lauren, I don't know if you had the same experience I did, but I learned about this in undergrad, and I found microgravity, those lectures, to be really fascinating because it kind of exposed a thing that is so obvious, but I had never thought about. And that is humans evolved under the very rigid assumption that gravity will be here. And like there's so many elements of our body's physiology that like we never think about it because we can always rely on gravity to exist and to be present. But there are so many elements of human physiology that really do assume that gravity is going to be in full force. And if it's not, things go a little bit haywire. So I'm sharing this obviously not because it's a practical tip, because it's just really cool. We're allowed to sometimes enjoy science just because it's fascinating. So when people go to space for extended periods of time, when they come back, they are in rough shape. So you absolutely will lose muscle mass when you go to space. There are different strategies they use to try to attenuate that, but you're gonna lose muscle when you go to space because you're not loading your muscles. The normal kind of activities of daily living that provide some type of tension on your muscular system, it's just really not there when you're in microgravity. And microgravity could be various degrees of gravitational pull, but if we're talking about super low or zero gravity situations, yeah, when people come back from a long stay in extreme microgravity, they lose a ton of muscle. They're usually I think they come back a little bit shorter. No, they come back taller. Yeah, because your spinal column kind of expands out a little bit uh, in the absence of that kind of constant gravitational pushing on that kind of axial loading. They come back with considerably lower bone density in many cases. And I just saw recently there's a study where they were finding that there's actually morphological changes to the brain tissue that they're observing in people that come back when they're in microgravity for a long time. And apparently those morphological changes seem to stick around for quite some time, like a number of years. So the soft tissue stuff in terms of like muscle, you can get that back. Bone density is not quite as easy when you're older to kind of rebuild that, but it is malleable to an extent. But the brain stuff I think is really fascinating. But all of that is to say, we evolved really relying on gravity to exist. So as long as it does, we'll be in good shape. But there's even things that happen like pretty much instantly. Like I'm pretty sure your plasma volume changes pretty considerably because of how the cardiovascular system kind of relies on gravity to kind of keep things the way they're normally working. So, Lauren, any strong feelings on microgravity? Any personal experience?
No personal experience. But yeah, I mean, I would echo your thoughts. And then also just to ponder the utility of doing some sort of prehab, like prior to going into that for an extended period of time, because that's certainly something that has been looked at for people who are undergoing, an elective surgery, for example. And so I wonder if doing a kind of focused period of resistance training and activities that would increase bone mineral density and muscle mass potentially could perhaps not attenuate the loss, but meaning that when you come back, you're not in such a lower, like your starting point is such that you're in a better place when you return.
Yeah, go from jacked to average instead of average to frail, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure that there is an emphasis on physical training and astronaut training. So I think they probably are leaning into that concept of kind of training for it ahead of time. And I also know there is a tremendous amount of money spent on trying to help astronauts maintain muscle mass and bone density during extended stays in microgravity. So all sorts of stuff with various types of equipment and machines and blood flow restriction training I know has been kind of discussed in that area. So really fascinating stuff there. But yeah, I mean, I guess if you wanted to try to make that practical, you could say, hey, maybe similar things apply to, trying to train, like train up before you're going to have an extended layoff, and then do whatever you can to try to maintain that during the layoff. But yeah, I just think microgravity is really cool because it's one of those elements of physiology that we never really think about how much we depend on gravity until it goes away, and then everything kind of falls apart, which is not ideal. All right, let's do something that's a little bit more practical. There's one that I'd like to answer here, um, and I think let's see. No, I think I already answered that one. Let's do. Oh yeah, this is a good one from Paul. So this one comes up all the time, Lauren. I'm sure you've had this with clients. Maybe you've experienced yourself. In the gym, what are good signs that you're actually building muscle and not just strength? Um, I know I've shared a personal experience about this. Constantly see people kind of hypothesizing about what kind of gains they might be making based on how things are going in the gym. My answer is the signs that you're actually building muscle and not just strength are not really going to be from the gym. I think those signs come elsewhere. So there was a time in my life where I did a very aggressive dreamer bulk. And I said, man, if I'm bulking up this big, this quickly, I should be able to deadlift a truck. And so I was deadlifting like crazy, and my deadlift kept going up and up and up and up, and my body weight kept going up and up and up. And I was like, this is all muscle. I can't believe my luck. And then one day, my roommate kind of took me aside and said, "Hey, Eric, no one else has the heart to tell you, but you look terrible. Like you're breathing heavier. Every time you walk up the stairs, I hear you like wheezing. This is not going well for you." And then I looked in the mirror again and said, "Oh, yeah, I see what you're referring to." But anyway, yeah. So I was bulking up super hard and I was stoked about it. He was like, "Yeah, this isn't going the way you think it's going." And so you do not want to just rely on raw strength as an indicator of whether or not you're building muscle, especially if you're talking about perhaps an exercise that you are kind of really leaning into, and perhaps you are getting better and better and more efficient because you're just getting better at executing the exercise. And that's particularly true with any kind of like high skilled movement. So bicep curl, not a lot of skill involved, but deadlift, barbell squat, front squat, there's a lot of skill involved. And you might find that you're just getting better at the lift and in parallel gaining weight, and the two might not necessarily be connected, and certainly the strength gains might not reflect actual muscle gain. So I would say signs that you're actually building muscle, I would think about things like, how is your clothing fitting? I think that's kind of my really reliable way of doing it. Or, use different reference points. So my belt loop is the same. However, I'm noticing more muscle in my chest, or my shirts are tighter in the chest and arm area or the shoulder area, but not in the belly area, the love handle area. So you start kind of thinking, okay, my pants, the waist is not getting any tighter, but the leg portion is. So maybe my quads are growing a little bit. So I think clothing fits good. I think checking the mirror is good. Sometimes you can do circumference measurements to supplement that if you really like to rely on more quantitative feedback rather than qualitative. But I would say, trying to make that distinction between, muscle and strength, it's probably not going to happen in the gym. It's going to be the stuff where you're looking in the mirror, seeing how your clothes fit, seeing how scale weight is moving, and trying to kind of triangulate those factors. Lauren, anything to add to that? Any personal experience? Any dreamer bulks in your past?
Can't say I've done the dreamer bulk, but I do think when you're looking at the output, maybe you should be looking more at the input. And so if we're going to say, is my training program optimal? Am I progressing? Is my nutrition optimal? Are there certain things that we know are better for the hypertrophic environment? Then we can say we're for sure doing everything we can to put ourselves in a position for muscle growth. And I think perhaps it's more important to focus on those factors and make sure that those are all in check, as opposed to worrying so much about monitoring the rate of muscle growth that we can kind of see with the naked eye, for example. And I think that often, especially for an advanced trainee, that's not going to be something that you'll visually see from week to week or month to month, especially if you're at a sort of normal level of leanness.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. Definitely. Um, yeah, it's really tricky, this kind of question, because it just comes up so frequently where people constantly want to kind of assess where they're at. You know what I mean? And yeah, trying to find ways to assess that and not, get led astray and get kind of off track. And a lot of times people get really stressed out about this thing, trying to figure out, okay, the scale weight's moving up. What am I going to do here? Yeah, it's one of those things that, any kind of way that you can try to track it. I mean, like you said, you need to make sure everything that you have is in check. I think when you do have everything in check, a little bit more faith in the process. But yeah, the moral of the story for sure, at least on my end, don't confuse strength gains for muscle gains, because they're not the same thing. All right, Lauren, I think we should probably hop into the chat here. We've got some good chatter going on. Let's see here. This is, I think, a good one for you. And as I'm reading it, do you mind twisting your microphone so that the logo is facing you? I think it'll give us some better audio quality. Yep, a little bit further.
Mm-hmm.
Well, while you're doing that, I'm going to answer one really briefly here. So there's a question about, can you talk about recovery diet? For what body fat percentage is it suitable for? So recovery diet, generally speaking, when people talk about a recovery diet, what they're talking about is, after someone is getting really, really lean, they are in a tight spot. If you get really, really lean with a really aggressive diet, you'll likely reach a spot where, you might need some hormones to recover to kind of get back to baseline. You might experience drops in thyroid hormone, drops in sex hormones, which we'll likely talk about in a little bit. you might be noticing that your metabolic rate is really low. You might be super hungry, super focused on food. And so what you want to do there is ideally get to a more sustainable spot and recover from that diet. And so usually people kind of talk about a dichotomy, which is more of a spectrum, but they talk about either reverse dieting or recovery diets. A reverse diet, usually people are going to add food back in very, very slowly. It's going to be a very prolonged process where you try essentially not to regain any meaningful amount of fat in the process. Uh, Recovery diet is a different approach where initially you make kind of a bigger jump. You say, you know what, in the first bit here, I'm probably going to regain a little bit of weight, a little bit of fat mass, get to a much higher caloric intake sooner. Not that you're kind of, going super high with your caloric intake. You're not eating like as much as you can possibly eat. But you're just saying, hey, I'm going to cut myself some slack and get back to a more sustainable body fat level and caloric intake. And Lauren, we collaborated on a case series that kind of compared and contrasted these two approaches in a way. And what we often find is that a recovery diet is generally a good option for someone who's done a pretty aggressive diet, gotten very lean, gotten their calorie intake very, very low. If you try to reverse diet, it's not easy. It's not particularly enjoyable. And essentially you don't recover. You basically, what we found was in that study, the people who tried hardest to do more of a reverse diet instead of a recovery diet, they really delayed their recovery. They didn't gain as much fat initially, but they also, their kind of journey back to in the direction of baseline in terms of restoring their metabolic rate, restoring their hormone levels, they just didn't recover. And so whenever I talk about recovery diet, I like to kind of compare and contrast the two and reiterate that in most cases, recovery diet is going to be the better option than reverse dieting. There's always exceptions to that, but if you're getting really shredded, recovery diet's usually the way to go. But the question here is, for what body fat percentage is it suitable for? And, I'd say it's suitable for anyone who wants to do it, really. But I think, where does it have the most utility, right? A recovery diet. I would say if you're someone who is dieting down to a body fat percentage that is sustainable for you, and so that would be, it's going to vary from person to person. I know for me personally, if I were to cut down to, let's pretend I'm at 20% body fat. I've been kind of all over the map in terms of body fat. If I were to cut down to 15, I wouldn't do a recovery diet because I wouldn't need to recover. It'd be a nice, easy cut. I'd say, oh, yeah, I lost those, 5 or 10 pounds, feeling good. I'm going to keep doing my thing and just eat at maintenance. And that's that. There's not really much to recover from. As you get leaner and leaner, that's where you start to say, okay, I think I actually have something to recover from here. I think I actually am experiencing considerable adaptation in terms of my metabolic rate, various hormone levels. And for me, it's not there's not like a specific threshold you reach. It kind of, as you get leaner and leaner, you start to notice those things a little more and a little more. But I would say for a lot of males, it seems to be like if you're cutting into like single digit body fat, especially if you're getting below like 8% body fat, you're probably not just going to cut down there and then say, yeah, I feel great and I'm totally content with my caloric intake and everything's good. Now, some people will, for sure. There's always going to be exceptions to that. But for most people, I'd say, yeah, getting below 10 to 8% as a male is usually when that happens. And then, Lauren, what would you say would be analogous female body fat percentages? Maybe into like the mid-teens, something like that?
I'd say, yeah, maybe a 14, 15%. But of course,
Yeah.
it's important to point out that this is depending on how you're measuring it, because what we see on a DEXA is not going to be the same as what we see in a BIA device. And is it a handheld or are you standing on a scale? Or so given all the different ways that we know there are to, imperfectly measure body fat percentage. I don't like to use those really general numbers for everybody, because we know that depending on that individual and how they're measuring it, then that can vary really widely.
Yeah, definitely. What about your answer here? So, for what body fat percentage is a recovery diet suitable? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you made some really great points. How low are you going? Are you doing one competition? Are you doing multiple competitions? In that sense, it would make sense to kind of stay fairly close to your competition body fat level. If you, as Eric Helms is, for example, are doing multiple competitions in a given month or two. But if your competitive season is over, or if you've dieted down for another reason to a body fat level that is unsustainable, and you're experiencing signs of that, or you have measurable signs of that, whether it's your metabolic rate or your blood work or what have you, then I think the only reason not to do a recovery diet is if you are trying to maintain that physique for some reason, and you're not actually trying to recover and come back to a place that is more sustainable long term.
Yeah, big time. I do want to address a nasty rumor that's going around in the chat. Um, and Lauren, I know how you're going to feel about this. So, it just says YouTube account. A lot of cowardice in people that make these types of allegations. It says Rex out here smashing beers during office hours. Okay.
Mm.
Now I wanna nip that in the bud. That's a pun now that I think about it. Uh, so this is a Budweiser Zero. Okay, this is non-alcoholic. Lauren has criticized me many times off the air for drinking Budweiser Zero. The reality is, I love beer, but I don't necessarily love alcohol. Um, oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. YouTube account is this individual's real name. So my mistake. That was insensitive of me to assume. But yeah, it's a non-alcoholic beer. So if you were hoping to catch, me kind of slipping into drunkenness over the next hour, unfortunately, it's not going to be quite that entertaining. But Lauren, I want to kick it to you and see if there's any questions that you are enthusiastic about answering, either in the chat or in the outline.
Well, I'd like to start by saying the fact that you just admitted publicly to drinking a Budweiser Zero brings shame on the Mass team, and I judge you less for drinking a real adult beer.
Well, we'll see. I mean, if Bud Zero wants to maybe sponsor the show, Office Hours Live, brought to you by Budweiser Zero. Maybe we'll see.
They should feel free to reach out.
That'd be
for
great.
sure.
Yeah. So what's on your mind? What kind of
Let's
question here?
go to a question from Instagram about satellite cells. And this individual is asking, are satellite cells required for muscle growth? And this is an interesting one because the answer is sort of maybe yes, maybe no. It's a bit nuanced, and there's for several years there was a disagreement in the literature about whether these are contributing to hypertrophy. And one of I guess we start with looking at the animal model research, which shows that if you delete satellite cells as you can in an animal, which you would never be able to do in a human, then the hypertrophic response is blunted. And there was also a paper that was widely cited looking at people who had used performance enhancing drugs, and that their sort of satellite cell pool was higher, indicating that, if you are taking anabolic steroids, then you're going to increase your satellite cell pool above and beyond what it would be if you were a natural lifter. But when you look at that literature a bit more closely, and then you look at some some studies in animal models again that look at older and younger rodents, for example. What we're seeing is more that satellite cells are very important to recovery and repair of tissue. And so if there's a model that causes damage, then you're going to see the activation, the proliferation of satellite cells. And that's not necessarily indicative of their contribution to a growth response, but rather a repair response. And when you look at, again, in rodents, because this is not something you could replicate in humans, but when you look at a younger mouse or rat versus a mature mouse or rat, you see that it looks like satellite cells contribute to growth when you are in development, but less so when you are mature. So I think, given the state of the literature as it stands, we could say satellite cells contribute to muscle growth during your growth phase, like when you are still maturing. So when you're a child, when you're an adolescent, that's likely the case. But once you're an adult, then they're still important as part of the muscle response to exercise, is particularly when it's a damaging bout of exercise. But it's not necessarily about the growth so much as it is the regeneration and the recovery portion of that.
That's
Anything to
interesting.
Yeah.
I had never heard that. So how do you feel about, I know back in the day, a few years ago, there was a lot of chatter about what at the time was pretty novel research indicating that people who use anabolics, they accumulate more satellite cells, and then even after they stop using anabolics and they detrain considerably, they retained a lot of those satellite cells. So they had greater satellite cell density, and a lot of folks said, "Hey, this is," and it. My understanding is that it was maintained for years and years after the cessation of anabolics, and so a lot of folks are saying, "Hey, we got to, people that get caught with anabolics, they need to be banned from sport for decades, banned for life, basically, because they're maintaining this advantage from these satellite cells." Would it be then fair to say that you think maybe those satellite cells won't necessarily guarantee greater hypertrophy in the future, but perhaps could confer other benefits in terms of like recovery responses to training? Or am I going too far out on a limb?
No, I think that when it comes to that question in particular, that study is almost 20 years old and hasn't been really followed up considerably because it's a tough one. You need to get a lot of people who are willing to get a muscle biopsy and also disclose that they've been using anabolics. But when you think about the contribution of a satellite cell to the fiber, meaning there are more myonuclei, then you're set up for a greater growth potential. So I do think that it's a bit of a different use case, because if you're saying, oh well, now I have a larger growth potential to work with as I continue to train, and then that could be one of the signs that the anabolic steroids is effective and is contributing to the growth potential, is enhancing that growth potential. And it's a bit speculative, but I think that's reasonable. Whereas when you're looking at just the regular activity of a satellite cell in a natural lifter, then you're not seeing such substantive contribution to the myonuclear domain.
Very interesting. One of the things I like about bringing you on is that you are our resident muscle expert. You have a lab with microscopes and sharp objects for biopsies, all that stuff. So, since you're here, I wanted to ask you another protein question that popped up in the chat, if you don't mind, or muscle related. That's how I'm making the leap to protein. In the last office hours, which was, and Mike, I think is the one they're referring to, talked a little bit about diet and protein older adults. And in this case, they put in parentheses 40 plus. Some folks are going to get very angry about that. You got to be careful about where you put the line there. 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, something. Um, any specifics about training at that age? Ways that should older adults be training specifically in a different manner because they're older adults? And then I'd be interested to hear your guidance on protein there as well, since it's focal point of the lab that you work.
Sure. I think that the literature tends to point to older individuals, and we wouldn't say 40 plus when we quantify that older label.
Where do you put it?
It's usually 65 where we would say you're older, maybe 60, and then in the sort of 40 to 60, we would say you're middle aged. But now that people are living longer, that will continue to evolve. So there you go. Yeah, there is some evidence to suggest that older individuals need more protein, and you can look at that at a protein synthetic response to a given meal, and where we see the ceiling of the response and to, let's say, 20 grams of protein, and you don't see that same response in a 20-year-old as you do in a 60-year-old. And I think on a practical level, we see that older individuals also just tend to eat less protein in general, because the average older adult is not, it might not even be meeting the RDA, which, from our perspective is low. So
Bodybuilders hit the RDA every meal, and then they do it 4 more times throughout.
that exceed the RDA. So yeah, in terms of training, I don't think we have any real concrete evidence to suggest that your resistance training program should be different. What we do see is that a really small volume or frequency or just dose of training is extremely valuable. And so if you go from doing not much to doing 30 minutes a week, that's huge. And what I do think with older adults is your physical function and maintenance of muscle mass in older adulthood will probably be better sustained long term if you sort of put money in the bank, if you will, in your younger and middle-aged years. So I would say it's never too late to start, and we definitely see muscle growth when an untrained person starts training at 65 or even 70, but that the magnitude of growth is far smaller than what we would have seen had they done that at 35 or 40. So I think the earlier we start, the better off we'll be.
Yeah, I think when it comes to, if I could throw my 2 cents in, I'm gonna take off my sciencey hat and put on my more practical in the trenches hat. One of my best buddies is in his 70s, and he's been lifting for decades and decades. We used to coach a powerlifting together, and it's been interesting to see how his training has evolved in recent years. And we would chat about, I mean, he still loves training. He's still really strong. But I have noticed that, I would ask him how he trains, how some of his peers have changed their training throughout the decades. And I have noticed that there is a lot of folks report that they like to kind of transition from more free weight stuff into more machine based training. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. You often find yourself in a more comfortable postural position, and you find yourself in a position where, one of the things that becomes important is just having really standardized range of motion. I think that helps a little bit with joints. So dumbbells, you're doing a dumbbell chest press, how low are the dumbbells going? It depends, right? You have to deal with your elbow angle, wrist angle, shoulder angle. And you could reach a spot where if the range of motion gets a little too long near the chest area, maybe you get a little bit of irritation, feel a little bit angry in the joints. So I have noticed a bit of a preference toward more machine work. And then another thing is like you have to think about, I mean, you kind of alluded to this, being older, that can look a lot of different ways, right? So like my buddy, he's jacked. Like he's still training like, a pretty, not too dissimilar from what he used to do. But if it's someone who is just getting into lifting because they're older and their doctor said, "Hey, like I'm worried about your bone density, you're at risk for osteoporosis, etc." Um, you know, that's a very different situation. And so if you're going into it and you have limited motor skills, you're not used to lifting and you already have, some of those symptoms of frailty, you might already have kind of low muscular strength. And, then you have to really think about balance and coordination. And you have to say, what are the exercises that we can do as safely as possible? Now, I don't think a lot of folks listening to this are in that position, but I do think a lot of people listening to this have a friend or a loved one or might train a client who could be in that position. So, elderly or older age or advanced age or however you want to put it, it can look a lot of different ways. And the degree of adjustment that you have to make kind of depends on exactly what you're talking about. But, there does come a point where safety is really, I mean, safety is always imperative, but if you're just getting into training in your 70s, and you are kind of low body weight, low muscle mass, potentially low bone density, you really got to think about stability and balance and make sure that you're not putting people in positions where they could have a really potentially dangerous fall. So always important to think of that. And also if you are a personal trainer and you're on the gym floor, hopefully you're already doing this, but like talk to folks about their history, about, sometimes if someone has a pacemaker, there might be some exercises that you wouldn't look at them and automatically notice they have a pacemaker, but you're going to have to make modifications. Or, perhaps they've had a history of stroke and they might have some motor deficits that need to be trained around. So you start getting older and stuff like that happens, and you gotta account for that. Um, all right,
Yeah,
Lauren.
I think I've written a couple of articles recently in Mass talking about machine-based training versus free weights and the kind of concept of functional training. And so I think that it doesn't necessarily just apply to older individuals, but there's a level of not only risk but also skill required to perform a barbell squat or a barbell deadlift, and the extent to which that's necessary is only to the extent that you either enjoy those exercises or you're trying to use them in a competitive setting. But otherwise, if you're just looking from a general fitness perspective to build some strength, build some muscle, we can really look to a wide range of exercise options and modalities. And that not only is relevant for older individuals, but also for any beginner who feels, like, oh, I'm really uncomfortable figuring out how to do a barbell squat. Hey, you can use a leg press. You can try hack squat, and you'll reap a ton of those benefits. And so I hope we can kind of get away from the paradigm of thinking, oh, if you're not doing these powerlifting exercises, then you're somehow missing the boat or your training program isn't effective, because that's really not the case.
I hope that Helms and Mike never listen to this because you dropped a hard power lift. There was a serious tone behind that. So
Ooh.
we're gonna move past that. I agree though. I love machines. I've been working through a nerve injury that you never want to have a nerve injury. If you're picking injuries, don't pick nerve.
Mm.
Pick muscle, tendon, ligament, whatever you want. Don't pick nerve. But I've been training around that, and machines have been fantastic for just putting me in a postural kind of position that's much more comfortable. Um, Again, a lot of slander in the chat right now. People saying that I'm middle aged. Um, that's actually not true based on the range that you gave, I don't think. But I have spoken to peers of mine who work in like marketing, and if you're 32, you are ancient. They're like, yeah, your money's no good here. Your clicks, your attention, your eyeballs, we're not interested in it. Yeah, if you go based on like business and marketing demographics, yeah, there's no use for a person that's 32 years old. That's the message that I've been getting loud and clear. So fully over the hill, and I'm okay with that. I think I can live. Um, all right, Lauren.
Let's switch gears to a nutrition question from the outline here.
Sure.
Someone's been wondering if intermittent fasting is good for growing muscle while staying lean.
Sure. Yeah. So I've written about that in mass quite a few times. Intermittent fasting, I think, is a really cool thing that you can try. It's a tool. It's not, necessarily dramatically better or worse than other eating patterns, but I know that when I first heard about it, many many years ago, I was like, it'll never work. It can't be done. And back then, a lot of what we collectively believed about protein was driven by a lot of mechanistic studies. We kind of were working, when I say we, I mean just like the general evidence-based fitness consensus. It's like, okay, so protein, the way it works is we eat it, right? And there's leucine in there, and it stimulates muscle protein synthesis. And if we have all the essential amino acids around, that's gonna, serve as the building blocks for actually building new muscle proteins. Um, After we stimulate muscle protein synthesis from a dose of leucine, we're going to have to wait out this refractory period, like maybe 2 or 3 hours, and then we can do it again with another dose of protein that has leucine. And by the way, each time we stimulate muscle protein synthesis, we actually max that out at a relatively, not a super high dose of protein. Maybe it's, 20 or 30 grams for someone who's younger. You can make the argument maybe up a little bit higher than that in older individuals, particularly if they're relatively low fitness status, I would say. But all of that is to say, we had this idea. It's like, okay, so based on those constraints, we know that you shouldn't, if you're eating more than like 20 or 30 grams in a meal, you're wasting it because you already maximize protein synthesis, and you need to be doing it every 3 hours. And the more you can do that, the more opportunities you have throughout the day to kind of stimulate muscle growth via protein synthesis. So I hope you weren't taking notes for that, because I don't really feel that way. Um, in the last few years, I mean, those mechanisms, there's interesting insights that we can glean from those mechanistic studies. It's tremendously valuable to understand how the body responds to the ingestion of a bolus of protein. So I don't want to diminish all the work that went into uncovering some of those mechanistic findings, but what we find in practice in the recent years, there's been a lot more of I would say, a bit of a shift toward a lot of very applied protein studies. Maybe they've always been out there, but I guess I've been paying more attention to them, where they say, okay, let's just, do some different protein feeding patterns with resistance training and see, which feeding patterns seem to be conducive to approximately optimizing gains in muscle. And I say approximately optimizing because, you know, it's hard to say that, one thing is truly optimal. That's not really what studies are for, is to say what is the optimal way to do this. In a study, we're saying which is better, A or B, or A, B, or C, right? So we're kind of comparing and saying, in aggregate, looking at the literature, which of these protein distribution patterns or feeding patterns seem to be conducive to making acceptably optimal gains. They're not hindering you compared to other alternatives. And what we found with some of those more applied studies, at least from my read of them, is that protein's not that hard to get right. You want to make sure you're having enough throughout the day. You still do want to split it up into multiple servings. That's the best bet. And based on the literature I've seen, I think 2 large protein servings per day is better than 1. I think 3 is slightly better than 2, but the difference isn't as big as you would think. And I wrote a whole article about a study that directly compared 2 versus 3. But then when you get beyond 3 boluses or servings of protein throughout the day, big servings, uh, the returns seem to be very diminishing, to the extent that there was one paper I reviewed in Mass that was 3 servings a day versus 6 servings a day. And both, I mean, they were fairly equivalent. They didn't do equivalence testing in that study, which, if you're a stat nerd, you know what I'm talking about. You're not a big deal. But basically, both of those the three protein servings per day versus six, the results were very, very similar in both cases. So it looks like as long as you're getting enough total protein, you're spreading it throughout the day with at least three distinct servings, you're probably doing about as good as you can do in terms of protein distribution. And what's really nice about that is with time restricted feeding or intermittent fasting, specifically with time restricted feeding, um, you can definitely do that, right? So time restricted feeding, a very common feeding window that we see is an 8-hour window and a 16-hour fast. So if you're doing a serving of protein at the beginning, the middle, and the end of an 8-hour feeding window, you've got 3 boluses of protein. And there's actual research of people doing time restricted feeding, lifting weights, following that protocol, and making really nice gains. So that particular approach so far in the literature doesn't seem to hold you back at all. Now, what's nice about time restricted feeding is that a lot of folks notice that without putting a lot of effort in, they start eating less. Their caloric intake goes down. And so for a lot of people, it seems to be helpful for fat loss applications. Now, there's an interesting study a couple months ago that said, hey, if you look at the literature, it doesn't really look like we're seeing major differences in like hunger. Like if we actually ask someone, give them a scale to rate their hunger, they're like, it doesn't really look like there's a distinct hunger advantage when it comes to time restricted feeding versus more typical dietary patterns. And a lot of folks are confused by that, but I think I would contend that one of the big benefits or one of the mechanisms by which time restricted feeding causes this passive, almost unintentional reduction of caloric intake, I think it's more practical than it is necessarily driven by hunger and appetite responses. So I think you literally have fewer opportunities to snack. You have fewer eating opportunities where you might eat a little bit more than you plan to. It's easier to, for example, roll out of bed, get a cup of coffee, start your day, get busy, get your mind focused on work, and you're not thinking about food yet. So for a lot of people, they feel like by the time they're actually like, oh, I actually am getting kind of hungry and thinking about food, it's already time to kind of begin that feeding window. So I think there are practical elements that make it helpful for fat loss or for the maintenance of a reduced body weight after fat loss has occurred. Now, Lauren, remind me, was the question, did it specifically ask about intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding?
They use the term intermittent fasting, and the question was also about, is it better for staying lean while growing muscle?
Okay. I would say no. I don't think there's any distinct advantage for staying lean while building muscle. Um, but for the reasons I just mentioned, I do think it's a viable option. I think some folks, and the more that you coach people, the more you start to think about what can work versus what is the perfect way. But yeah, I don't think it's distinctly advantageous for that application, but I do think it's a great option. You can definitely do it, and I don't think you'd be holding yourself back if you compare it to a more typical eating schedule. And again, I've answered this question as if it was about time restricted feeding. One of my least favorite things in the world, a very unfortunate set of circumstances, is that in the fitness world, the the individuals who first popularized time restricted feeding referred to it as intermittent fasting. And so there's this huge disconnect where when scientists talk about intermittent fasting, it's a completely different thing than when a lot of fitness professionals or enthusiasts talk about intermittent fasting. So time restricted feeding is what a lot of fitness folks call intermittent fasting, which is where every day you have a feeding window and a fasting window, but you're eating similar amounts of food every single day. Intermittent fasting is a collection of strategies that usually involve having an entire day where you're either totally fasting or you're eating very, very little, like maybe only like 25% of your typical caloric intake. And so with intermittent fasting, you might do alternate day fasting. So every other day you fast, which, like I said, is 0 to 25% of your normal caloric intake. You might do the 5-2 diet. People have heard of that, maybe. where you just pick 2 specific days a week where you're going to be fasting. So yeah, intermittent fasting, that is where you start to lose me a little bit. Now, I don't think that intermittent fasting is something that's going to completely destroy your gains. I'm sure you can still get in very good shape doing it, but that is a spot where I would say we are no longer in the approximately optimal neighborhood in terms of maintaining or building new muscle mass. I think your body, if you're going an 8-hour feeding window, it'll be fine for the next 16 hours without a new bolus of protein. But when we start getting into full day fasts, for example, and you're thinking, okay, I had my dinner, then I slept a whole night, then I had a full day fast, then I slept a whole night. We're starting to get into a pretty extended period of time there where I think we are likely to actually have some impairment in terms of gains. Now, that was quite a monologue, Lauren. I'd love to hear what you think about it.
I think the only thing I would add is when you're looking to grow muscle, if hypertrophy is the primary goal, then perhaps it's not the best strategy, because just as you said, it might be helpful for fat loss because you're shortening the feeding window and you have fewer opportunities to eat. And so although there's no magic to the fact that you have a shorter feeding window, it just practically might be a good, helpful strategy to implement if you are trying to be in a caloric deficit. But if we look at the flip side, where we're trying to be in a maybe small surplus because muscle growth is the goal, then you could end up getting that it might be detrimental to implement that strategy, because now we have to cram all these calories into a shorter feeding window. And so you're and depending on how much you're eating and how your appetite is regulated, etc., that might still be a viable strategy. But I don't know that it's something I would go to as a recommendation for somebody who states like, oh, muscle growth is my primary goal.
Yeah, yeah. The only time I do it when the goal is like muscle growth, the only time it's top of mind is, I think in this question they mentioned that they wanted to stay pretty shredded while stay lean while building muscle, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So when I hear that, I think of a particular scenario, which is a person just did a pretty significant fat loss phase, and now they want to transition into a muscle building phase, which means in that scenario, they're usually looking for a razor thin surplus from where they are now. And a lot of times, folks in that particular scenario are still really hungry when they are in a small surplus because of that prior weight loss phase. So sometimes a lot of people it almost gets back to that, reverse diet, recovery diet. What do I do after I've gotten lean, but I want to transition into building muscle? That is a scenario where a lot of folks just seem to be more satisfied if they have a very ravenous appetite and they're trying to keep that in check. That's an application where I think time restricted feeding can be really, because there's nothing sadder, having been there, than when you try to allocate. Helms right now is probably feeling some of this. When you're on 1,500 calories a day as a full grown adult man and you're allocating that across 6 meals, that is depressing. You do not want to look at what, compared to what you bulked on, it's just devastating to divvy that up across 6 meals. It can really go a long way to say, we'll cut it into 3. That's a good 500 calorie meal every time I sit down to eat. A lot of folks, if hunger is a challenge, or just being really fixated on food as a challenge, that's an area where intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding can shine. But like you said, if someone is struggling to get the food down and they really have to push a surplus to bulk up, then it's going to be detrimental. It's going to be harder because, yeah, now you're talking about splitting 3,500 calories into those 2 or 3 meals that are happening pretty close together, which is tricky.
I'd also just add that it's misguided to think that you're going to be in a prime state for muscle growth if you are you dieted down and your current maintenance is really low, and you're trying to sort of recover, or whatever term we want to use there. The it's going to require a substantial increase in calories, period, before you are in a prime state to grow muscle.
Yeah.
And so, yes, you can stay lean or leanish, and maybe not be as hungry as you were, and those are all totally viable strategies to maintain a certain physique, but not to put yourself in a state where the body and the system is going to prioritize hypertrophy.
Yeah. Yeah. And that gets truer and truer the leaner that you get, right? I mean, if you're shredded and you're trying to build muscle, that is going to be an uphill climb. You can distribute your meals however you want. That's going to be really tough. If you're, kind of lean, then maybe you have a better option or a better opportunity. But to kind of wrap that up and give a concise answer that's actionable, um, is it good for getting muscle while staying lean at the same time? It's a viable strategy, but there's so many of those other contextual factors that will dictate, what's your likelihood of success of cruising toward muscle gain while staying lean? It's going to depend, but intermittent fasting is not inherently better or worse in that scenario across the board when compared to just a typical eating schedule. But depending on your circumstances, you might find it to be helpful. You might find it to be actually more of a hindrance, which is how it goes sometimes in nutrition. All right. Are there any other ones that were calling to you? Any questions that you'd really like to address here?
Is there anything in the chat, or should we grab something else from the questions people submitted online?
The questions we submitted online. Let's see here. I got a kick out of someone asking how to prevent and reverse hair loss. I'm actually not the guy to ask about that, believe it or not. With my freshly shaved head, I would refer to acceptance and commitment therapies. That's I talk about those for nutrition sometimes, but yeah, I'm definitely not the stop hair loss guy. Question here that I'd like to address really quick, just because there were two questions that came up about it. This is from the outline. There were two questions about testosterone. So one of them was referring to the barbell medicine folks, listening to their podcast. Good content over there at Barbell Medicine. Highly recommend. Jordan and Austin were talking about testosterone, and it sounds like they're basically saying, hey, anything you can do to kind of naturally increase your testosterone, probably not going to be a large enough increase to really move the needle in terms of building muscle or performing better in sport. And then there's another question, how much do we need to increase testosterone in terms of nanograms per deciliter to really see a difference in terms of muscle mass and strength, and can we get it naturally? So those are, I think, kind of the same question, and it comes up a lot, and so it's something I've answered before, but not everyone hears it the first time you say it, in fitness. So it's always good to go back and kind of revisit questions like this, because they come up so frequently, and the more places you say it, the better. So testosterone, it certainly has, there's a relationship, right, between testosterone and muscle mass. And it's not hard to see that, when you look at really high supraphysiological doses of anabolics, yeah, people grow, you see that. But when it comes to, fluctuations within the kind of typical range, so I'm going to go with male numbers here. And the reference range, you'll see different ranges presented in different places, but usually it's like 300 to 1200 nanograms per deciliter is roughly. Sometimes it only goes up to 1000 or 1100, but that's pretty much what we're talking about there. And so a lot of folks, a lot of, young, healthy men will have testosterone in the 500, 600 range. And they say, what would happen if I can get it up from 600 to 650? I mean, basically nothing, right? In terms of performance, muscularity, strength, that's not going to move the needle. Usually, like James Krieger's done really great, has written some really great articles about this, but He kind of worked out the numbers and basically said, yeah, if you can bump up from one quartile to another, you might be able to get a kilogram or two. That might be what you predict in terms of increase in fat-free mass. And I mean, even that's probably a little ambitious. So realistically, any kind of intervention shy of TRT, anything short of an exogenous uh, implementation of anabolics, you're probably not going to be moving it by a large enough magnitude to really see a meaningful difference in terms of strength, hypertrophy, performance. You're probably going to need to get things moving by, I would say, at least bare minimum 200, 300 nanograms per deciliter, uh, at least. And I'm not aware of any kind of natural intervention that's going to reliably do that for you. However, all that being said, there are some applications where I think it does make sense to try to increase your testosterone. Whether you want to go the pharmacological route or try other alternatives, totally up to you. Medicine has applications. I'm never the person who says never use a pharmacological treatment, but there are some folks who say I'm just not really. I feel like my testosterone's low. I have low libido, low energy level, things like that. And they're wondering, are there things I can do, kind of lifestyle interventions that might help with that? And, I don't have the paper on hand, but I did read a paper that talked about how low testosterone can kind of vary from person to person. And for a lot of folks, there's kind of a key threshold where it's like once their testosterone drops below that threshold, which is specific to them, they start to notice some of those other effects. So we're not talking about muscularity or strength or performance, but we're just talking about low energy level, low vitality, low libido, things like that. And it's generally like if you had to pick a number, you'd say probably around 300 nanograms per deciliter. But for some people, it could be 400. For some people, it could be 200, right? But somewhere in there. And I do think that there's, a solid justification for the idea of trying to do things to get over that threshold. If you're just below it, I do think there are natural things that can get you just above it that are worthwhile and might impact quality of life, subjective energy level, things like that. And so in that case, things like getting enough exercise, but not too much, getting plenty of sleep. There are some dietary factors that come into the mix, making sure that you're not short of any key micronutrients, because there are some micronutrients in the diet, things like zinc and magnesium, that if they're super, super low chronically, it could potentially impact testosterone levels. So there's not like one magic herb that I would say this is the one to do. But there are things both in terms of activity, lifestyle, behavior, and also some nutritional factors, specifically some micronutrients that could get someone from just below that threshold to just above that threshold. But if you're trying to get from 200 to 900, it's not going to be from anything that's shy of exogenous hormone administration. Fair enough?
I think you covered it.
All right. Any other questions that you wanted to get to? There's a couple fun ones that I wanted to end on, or that I had in mind.
Go for it.
Well, now I have to find it. There was one that really jumped out to me. Where did it go? It was about, yeah, here we go, from Charlie. What study would you conduct if you were completely freed from the constraints of funding, ethics, or sanity? I really wanted to ask this one because I want to know more about who Lauren is as a human being and what kind of ideas are kicking around in that head.
I needed some time on this one. Okay. This is a brainstorming question.
It is a brainstorming question.
I mean, I think it's, it's helpful to talk about the fact that, or acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of parameters and constraints around what we do because it's in humans. And so what you can do in an animal, you can't do in a human, or the length of period, like the length of time you can do something. Or, I'm reviewing some data right now that I've been collecting, looking at hormone levels in women across the menstrual cycle. And I have 9 bloods like over the cycle. And when you're trying to sort of model it and plot it and compare one person to the other, all you can think is, oh, like if only I had daily measurements. And that's something that we would never be allowed to do. You can't take blood from a person every day. It would just never be approved. It's considered invasive and it wouldn't be considered ethical. So that's top of mind when I think of just a small thing that would kind of enhance the quality of the data, just to be able to do things that are considered invasive, but do them on a more frequent basis. Um, and of course, the biggest issue is that we can't control everything. And so whenever we're doing any kind of nutritional intervention, exercise intervention, you want it to be as tightly controlled as possible. So if we're doing a training study, don't train outside of the study. But of course, you're going to have people with different kind of daily activity levels, and that's really hard to control and monitor. And the same thing goes for nutrition, and you're often relying on self-report and people being honest and candid. And so I think that I can't give you a specific study in mind, but if I were doing the study, I'd say we need to lock everybody up and we need to monitor absolutely everything they do so that we know there's no confounding variables.
I hear you. Well, I actually have I have one kicking around because I had the gift of thinking about that answer previous. You raised a lot of good points. Like it is tricky when you're trying to like do a study because you have to think about, okay, how is this actually going to work? And with like rodent studies, you have a lot more flexibility. I mean, of course, there's still ethical, very strict ethical constraints on rodent studies, as there should be. But yeah, once you throw human studies into the mix, it gets even more and more and more restrictive on what you can do. So I'm going to answer this question as if I don't have to be the one doing it, okay? Because I don't want to do what I'm going to propose. But so I recently started up over at Duke University, and I work in Herman Poncer's lab, and we do research on energy expenditure. And hey, what do you know? I'm interested. You know, I've been writing about that stuff for ages. I've written a million mass articles about it, but there's still a lot that kind of eludes us in terms of the regulation and the adaptability of energy expenditure. And now I'm at this lab at Duke that has all these cool toys, right? So we've got our 24-hour energy chamber, the metabolic chamber of secrets, we call it. And we've got doubly labeled water capability. And I would just want to throw the kitchen sink at it and say, once and for all, give me someone who's lifting. And well, many people. I'd have to repeat this many times over, but I just want to throw everything at it. You know, the best wearable trackers, doubly labeled water, a few stays in the metabolic chamber, also getting doubly labeled water during that stay and when they're going about their daily life. And I'd want to watch them go through bulking phase, a cutting phase. I'd want to go all over the map with it and see, okay, what does it look like when a weight stable person tries to bulk intentionally? What does it look like when they try to cut down super hard? I'd want to go as far as we could go, basically. And then what does it look like when that person then returns back into, you know, positive energy balance from a very, very lean weight reduced state? I'd want to just look at all of it. And it'd be cool if you could do that, but it also, I will admit, that's not a good study. That's just an interesting observation, right? So, like, one of the things to keep in mind with planning research studies is you have to be able to answer a specific question. You have to be very deliberate. What is the question that I'm asking? And so, what I just explained was like, hey, I want to follow someone around and learn all these things and then do it, you know, 40 or 50 more times to see how generalizable it is and try to get an idea of what is the typical response and what kind of variability are we looking at in the population. But yeah, those are the kinds of questions that kind of keep me up at night. How are people really responding to that? And how can we get a really good look at it? Because when you get into the literature on energy expenditure regulation, one of the things that's so immensely frustrating is all of the things that we have to assume in any particular study paradigm, right? So like all of the different methodological considerations, like a lot of people went back into the metabolic adaptation literature and they said, hey, you're not really accounting for organs. We tend to lose organ mass, and organs have a very high rate of metabolism relative to fat tissue and even relative to muscle tissue. You start looking at a lot of the doubly labeled water studies, and we have to do things like assume an amount for the thermic effect of feeding if we want to make inferences about, basal metabolism versus total daily energy expenditure. There's a lot of assumptions that get kind of baked into every individual method, which is why if I didn't have to be the one doing all of it and sleeping in the, monitoring during the overnight metabolic chamber stuff, it'd be cool to just throw it all in there and just try to minimize those assumptions as much as possible. You do serial MRIs so you can look at the organ masses individually. It'd be so cool. But hey, maybe over the next 30 years, I'll chip away at those research questions one by one instead of doing it all in one giant, overly burdensome study that no person would ever volunteer.
I have one that came to mind while you were talking, and
Perfect.
that is what I think there's probably something to being physically active as a child and as an adolescent that translates to your propensity for muscle mass and strength gain when you start doing structured resistance training as an adult. But we can't do studies on children like that. So we don't really have that data. So I think it would be really interesting to see the impact of being a fairly sedentary kid versus being a kid that was physically active but wasn't doing any kind of structured resistance training versus being a kid that started resistance training as a teenager, and then follow that to see as an adult what even if you all adopt the same lifestyle habits, if you are kind of setting yourself up for more success based on what you do when you are in a maturation phase, and then if there are kind of later ramifications, because it sort of goes back to what I was saying before about setting yourself up to be in the best position possible when you're an older adult by being more physically active as a younger or middle-aged adult. And so it's a question that I think would be really, really interesting, and potentially kids should be physically active regardless, but there are some kind of concerns about how old is appropriate for somebody to start resistance training. And I think just culturally, in high school, there's a lot more men that will start lifting weights, whereas the younger women tend not to do formal resistance training until a bit later in life. So that would be a question that I think would be really fun to explore, but ethically and practically pretty difficult.
Yeah, and I'm increasingly interested in those kind of lifetime trajectories and how those things can kind of make an impact later in life. And it is an area, I think there's already a lot of research in our field pertaining to aging, and it's only going to get more prevalent and more pertinent. I mean, when you look at, I was just in a presentation a few weeks ago, someone who studies kind of population level health, and they kind of showed the projected age ranges of the country, and they're showing like, here's what it looks like now, and here's what it looks like in 25 years, and here's what it looks like in 50 years. And we're going to be very old, Lauren. There's going to be a lot of old folks. And, we really need to make sure we can figure out how to help a country age successfully and maintain independence and maintain strength and mobility. It's so, so important for quality of life. So that research is already known to be very important. It's already prevalent, but it's just going to be getting even more important. And to close out tonight, there was a comment in the chat that said, feel like Dr. Trexler could be a double for Agent Shaw, Fast and the Furious. Do you watch the Fast and the Furious? Have you seen those movies?
I haven't seen all of them because there are many, but
There
I've
are.
seen. um, are there 9, 11?
I think there's at least 10.
Yeah. I dropped off at some point.
Yeah.
Um, but Agent Shaw.
Yeah. So I saw this comment, and by the way, I've only seen one Fast and Furious movie. I went on a date and saw one many, many years ago, and it was like Fast and the Furious 5. And the person I was on a date with, basically it was like, "Oh, I love this film franchise. It's so good. Let me catch you up so that you don't feel lost about the plot." And I was like, I think I'll figure it out. It's like fast cars, they blow up. I'll be able to piece this one together. So, but anyway, I saw that comment and I was just like, please let this be. Oh, I'm blanking on his name now, but I had someone in mind. What's his name? Jason Statham. I was like, please let him be that character. And lo and behold, I was on IMDb when I should have been paying attention, and I did find Jason Statham's the guy. So we have the technology. I'm gonna put it up on the screen. You're gonna be blocked very temporarily here, but that's me and my buddy Dwayne the Rock Johnson. I actually tried to email him a few years ago, and he never got back to me. Frustrating, but hey, people called me old. They questioned my beverage choices, but if I can get one Jason Statham per live stream, I'm gonna be really thrilled with that. I think if you shave your head, someone's going to compare you to some bald guy, and that's about as good as you can do.
Yeah, that's where I was gonna go with it. People think all blondes look alike, and people think all bald men look alike.
That's
So,
true.
not to take away that compliment from you, I think
No,
that you
I
should
look nothing like
totally
that,
lean
man.
in.
but it's one of those things. Like if someone's going to say, "Oh, you look like this person," it's like, please be someone who looks way better than me. Like you got to be hoping for it.
Yeah, well, Vin Diesel's bald, right?
Yeah, that's
Why
true.
not? uh, Let's
I
throw
look
him
like
into the mix.
honestly, when you think of all the bald people who have been in Fast and Furious, I mean, there's something going on there. There might be like an environmental thing because they had The Rock in there, they had Statham, they had Vin Diesel. I think that there could be something going on there. I don't know what, but for such a rare thing, a man losing their hair, only like 1 out of 3 people happens. I mean, what's the odds that 3 people would be in the same movie? Just something to think about.
Clearly, the set could benefit from some of that anti-hair loss supplementation.
Exactly. Yeah. Like I said, I've never looked into it, so I could not answer that question in the outline, but my relationship to hair loss is well known and visible. All right, so I think that does it for tonight. Once again, I want to thank everyone for joining us. If you enjoy these live streams, or if you listen later on podcast, there are ways you can support the show, which we would appreciate. The easiest way is to like and subscribe wherever you get it. So we do it live on YouTube. It stays up on YouTube, and we also send it to all the major podcast platforms. So like, subscribe, leave a review, preferably a good one. But if you have to be honest, we understand. So that's one thing you could do. Another thing that you could do is you could think about subscribing to the Mass Research Review. So everyone that hosts these live streams, these office hours, we're all co-authors of the Mass Research Review. Every month on the first of the month, without fail, we release a new issue of Mass where we review all the newest and most interesting science pertaining to health and fitness and strength and everything you'd want to see. Nutrition, psychology, anything related to your health, your fitness, your wellness. We try to throw it in there. Of course, there's a bias towards lifting because we like lifting. We're going to do a lot of lifting stuff, but we do put plenty of other stuff in there as well. So yeah, those are the ways to support us if you feel so inclined. If you want to submit questions, I'll put a link in the show summary or the show description. You can ask questions for a future episode. And as always, we really appreciate everyone who contributed questions for this episode. So that does it for tonight. Everyone have a fantastic week, and I will see you exactly 1 week from today.